Best known for the films Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting and SLAUGHTERHOUSE-FIVE, theater, television, and film director George Roy Hill was one of the most successful filmmakers of his generation.
You know, in terms of a director, he had story sense, he had choreography, he had camera sense, he had certainly acting chops.
Music,
you know, there were no weaknesses.
No weaknesses.
The collaborators of George Roy Hill, including picture editors C.McKay and S.Rotter, ADR supervisor Mel Zelnicker and Michael Jacobi, re-recording mixers Tom Fleishman and Dichter, and ADR voice casting director and actor Bruce Winant came together to talk about their work together on The Sting, Slaughterhouse-Five, The World According to GARP, and Funny Farm. I'm your host, Isabel Sadurni, and this is Frame by Frame. Frame by Frame is presented by Post-New York Alliance because it's how you finish that counts. You can share this conversation through our website, bit.do/framebyframe, or via Twitter at @postny. Write us with comments and suggestions for future episodes at framebyframe@postnewyork.org. This session was recorded at Soundtrack in New York City. Hill came to filmmaking at age 40, having enjoyed an early life studying theater and music at Yale and Trinity College, flying as a wartime pilot in World War II in Korea, and working as an actor and director in theater and television. It was his exceptional talent there that got him invited to join a handful of directors working on a hugely popular television show, Playhouse 90.
Playhouse 90, even more so than the early anthologies like Lux and Kraft and Chrysler, was really more of a theatrical piece. It was the first 90-minute television anthology. All the other ones were 60 minutes, and they thought, well, let's see if we can expand this to like the length of a real play. And so it was a rather ambitious idea to take a 90-minute live broadcast back in 1956 when it started. And so people like George were grounded in theater primarily, and then moved into this whole new medium of being able to direct multiple cameras at the same time for a live broadcast.
That's Bruce Winant. Bruce grew up in a showbiz family, the son of Emmy Hall of Fame inductee Ethel Winant, associate producer and head of casting for some of the legendary television shows of our time, including Playhouse 90. Bruce has starred in numerous Broadway shows and appeared in countless film and television productions. Bruce is also co-owner with Dan Fink of Loopers Unlimited, the top Loop Group ADR voice casting company in New York City. Bruce continues to work with A-list directors like Martin Scorsese, John Frankenheimer, Robert Altman, Darren Aronofsky, and Wes Anderson.
All the producers, all the directors, and the writers, as well as the actors, were mostly theater. You know, they were kind of born and bred theater people. And that's what they wanted. A lot of them came from Broadway. A lot of them came from early films. And the directors of that time were masters at being able to juggle, 8 balls in the air. Okay, we've got the cameras on that stage, and the cast has to move over here and make sure he gets into his costume and enters here at the right time. And, we break for commercial. Okay, we can redress this set. Everything had to be pinpoint precise. And it took a really, really special kind of director with that kind of organizational mind to be able to do things like that. They really kind of scoured for this unique talent and came up with these remarkable young directors like Sidney Lumet and Arthur Penn and Franklin Schaffner, and then George Roy Hill. And that was kind of the launching pad for a lot of these directors who went on to win Oscars and make some of the great classic films that we all know today.
As a boy, Bruce was often on the set of Playhouse 90 watching his mother work as one of the producers for the show. I asked him to describe how an episode came together.
They would do like a week of rehearsal, and it was rehearsed like a play. They would do table reading, they would get up, they would block it, while the cinematographers would be putting lines on the floor and then picking them up and moving them again as everything changed. The sets were going up around them as they were rehearsing. And they would do multiple stages. CBS Television City, which had just been built in Los Angeles, was this new state-of-the-art studio for live television. And they would have 3 or 4 stages right next to each other. So you would play a scene in one of them and then run down the hall to the next stage to make your entrance for the next scene if they couldn't fit the set on that particular stage. So the coordination of all of that was phenomenal. And whoever was directing, they'd be in the booth looking at all the various stages and off the various cameras, and kind of like a football game, calling, camera 1, camera 5, go, camera 3. And to watch that coordination was pretty remarkable. It really was like mission control. And they would have, usually, I think they had 2 camera runs, full run-throughs on the broadcast day. And they'd take dinner, they would fix whatever they needed to fix, and then they'd go live that night. And there was rarely a glitch. Later on, when it went more to videotape, they could actually stop and retake things if they had to. But even then, they ran them straight through. It really was just a miracle of coordination, and the director was in charge of all of it.
They had individual theaters around town that they converted into TV studios. There wasn't a big complex like in L.A., I think.
I think that was probably why they moved Playhouse 90 to L.A., was because they just didn't have the space in New York to do something like that. Pretty much everyone involved were New Yorkers, but they had CBS built the facility primarily for their anthology television. And I guess all 133 shows were done there.
I think a lot of them learned their lenses on Playhouse 90,
That's picture editor C.McKay, whose credits include work with directors such as Warren Beatty, Jonathan Demme, and Arthur Penn. He worked with George Roy Hill on the film Slaughterhouse-Five.
I know that the 3 that I worked with out of the bunch, could call give me an 80 here, give me a 50 here, 120 here. They all knew, especially Sidney. He knew exactly what lens he wanted to use for what shot. And they really had to know ahead of where they wanted to be and what they wanted to look like. And, a lot of them didn't have film experience.
But they did have one thing. They all could stage a scene.
Yes.
Yeah,
They never even had to think about it.
Yeah.
It came naturally.
That's Eddie, Emmy, and Oscar-winning picture editor S.Rotter, whose credits include The Right Stuff, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Enchanted, My Blue Heaven, Ishtar, The Parent Trap, What Women Want, and The World According to GARP, directed by George Roy Hill.
In terms of a director, he had story sense, he had choreography, he had camera sense, he had certainly acting chops.
Music.
There were no weaknesses.
No weaknesses.
I don't think they had videotape then either.
1957, they went to videotape. They only lasted 1 year live. And then by 1959, it had become such a huge operation that Playhouse 90 became kind of a bi-weekly series. And John Frankenheimer was trying to do them all and realized, oops, I can't do that. And that's when they found these, other great directors who can put together a 90-minute live production in a week, more or less. But I guess those Playhouse 90s and those early television productions, gave him the bug and gave him the cachet to become the director that he became. One of his big launching pads was a period of adjustment from Broadway and then to the television version for Playhouse 90, which he also did on Broadway, I think. And I think he was in it as well. He was also an actor in it.
I actually have a great story that he told me about how he became an actor. And he was a real classical music aficionado, played the piano every day, and started out as a composition major at Yale, and his professor was Hindemith. So what happened was, George said that he really was doing really terribly in that class. He just couldn't get it. And one day Hindemith came up to him and he said, Mr. Hill, I saw you in Pirates of Penzance on campus, and I'll make a deal with you. I'll pass you in this course if you concentrate on acting. But anyway, that's his story about how he became an actor and then drifted into directing.
Once he started, once he got the kind of acclaim for, I think it was Judgment at Nuremberg, was his big Playhouse 90. He did 4. He gained such acclaim from that Hollywood came calling and said, hey, we need people like that. And my mother, who was the original associate producer and casting director, worked very closely with Marty Manulis and John Houseman and the other producers, along with John Frankenheimer, to find the talent, mostly top actors and all the young new actors, she would go to literally a play a night, every night in New York. And she would hit every off-Broadway, off-Broadway. So she said, hey, I just saw this guy in an off-Broadway play. He was really good. He's this good-looking kid. Let's bring him in. And Marty Manuel said, no, just cast him if you think he's right. So Robert Redford did his first job. But that's the kind of thing she would do. She would find this raw talent and bring him into Playhouse 90. And it became this phenomenal pool of actors. And I guess, working with Robert Redford, that was one of George Roy Hill's great...
It's also his great buddy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He and Newman and Redford were always playing practical jokes on each other. Paul Newman would saw George's desk in half, just come in with a power saw and saw it in half. And George would just take a board, put it over the desk, and hammer the board so the desk would be straight. And he loved the desk that way. So they were constantly, one-upping one another. But George was very familiar with Redford and Newman. That was like his little gang.
I knew that he and Newman would socialize with Gore Vidal.
See, I didn't know that, right?
Yeah, and I found it out in a weird way. I had a place up near Rhinebeck, and I was rushing to get out of the Brill building, and I'm in the elevator with John Hill. He says, where are you going? I said, well, I've got a place upstate. I'm trying to, get up there. He said, whereabouts? And I told him, and he says, oh, I know that. He said, we used to go up to Gore Vidal's house all the time, and, with Newman and hang out, and George. And it turns out that where they used to go was right at the end of the road where I lived.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Slaughterhouse-Five in 1972, taken from Kurt Vonnegut's novel, won the jury prize at the Cannes Film Festival that year. Picture editor C.McKay, re-recording mixer Tom Fleishman, and ADR supervisor Michael Jacobi discussed their work on Slaughterhouse-Five.
I was like a sound editor / ADR editor.
Everything.
Jack of all trades. Throw it to Craig. And I think probably the most exciting thing that happened to me on Slaughterhouse-Five is that they sent me over to Reeves on East 43rd? 44th, right, to do some ADR with Montana Wildhack.
Valerie Perrine.
Valerie Perrine, right. And we had a great session. And during the session, she invited me to her crash pad in L.A. And I was like dumb all afternoon. I couldn't think about it.
Right.
And there was no way I could get to L.A. I was working like crazy, so. But at least that was it was a fun thing.
But that movie was really one of his best things. I mean, it's just so poetic.
Yeah.
With Bach in the background, and Dee Dee, I mean, it was just magnificent.
Slaughterhouse was a film about film editing as much as almost anything else. I remember, actually, Craig, I think you brought me onto that as the sound apprentice.
That's Michael Jacobi, who was the sound apprentice on Slaughterhouse-Five. Additional credits include ADR assistant on Dog Day Afternoon, first assistant editor on Network and Apocalypse Now, and first assistant sound editor on Apocalypse Now, sound editor on Sophie's Choice, Rumblefish, and Scarface, and ADR on Places in the Heart, Biloxi Blues, Postcards from the Edge, and Far and Away.
And one of the things I noticed about George, how much involved he was in the sort of technical process. And I remember there was a film within the film when Billy's looking at Montana Wildhack on screen. I think he said to Dee Dee, throw it out of sync so it looks like a cheaply dubbed foreign film. And he had a real ear for things, too. There's a scene where there's a crash of the Cadillac, and George wanted a throatier sound. So when the muffler falls off the Cadillac, it ultimately kills his wife.
Yeah, she dies of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Right. Vince Connolly was the sound editor. So George kept saying to Vince, make it throatier, make it throatier. So Vince took the muffler off of a Cadillac, and George said, nope, it's not throaty enough. And they didn't have a lot of sound faders, going. So Vince would take, about 5 feet of acetone, and he would wipe the tracks so that they would have these sort of built-in fade-outs. And he must have had to go out and record 4 or 5 different things till he finally recorded a Mack truck with no muffler on it. And George said, okay, that's good enough.
I was actually part of that recording situation. I was working at Image Sound Studios, which was a precursor to Sound One.
That's re-recording mixer Tom Fleishman, whose credits include work with directors such as Martin Scorsese, Jonathan Demme, Spike Lee, Errol Morris, Robert Benton, Alfonso Cuarón, Brian De Palma, Mike Nichols, Francis Ford Coppola, and George Roy Hill. Tom was the re-recording mixer for Slaughterhouse-5.
We kept going out to record this car. They had a Cadillac.
Right.
And first they took the muffler off, and then they took off one or two of the spark plugs out of the engine so it wouldn't fire right. And there was just nothing they could do. And Vince kept complaining that Dick Vorsak had some kind of a filter in his console that wouldn't allow the low frequency through. And this is why this stuff wasn't working. This thing kind of drove Vince Connolly over the deep end.
Yeah. Yeah.
On that film, that was the first time he had worked with Milos Andricek.
Yeah.
And all of those transitions that we thought, that everyone thought was just magnificent editing, were planned. He had planned them. And, you know, for Didi, it was simple. You just did what was there.
Yeah.
But from then on, Myrick did all of George's films, I think. And Didi would always complain that she never got the ones that were popular and won Academy Awards. She only got the tough ones, which was kind of true.
Except for he did a similar thing, I guess, visually on the Sting. It was a very specific, way he framed and lit the picture.
That was one of the ones that she was annoyed about because it was Bill Reynolds instead of her.
Instead of her.
And then his art director was Henry Bumstead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And he was actually in Slaughterhouse and went on to work until he was in his late 90s for Clint Eastwood. You know, he had a crew around him that worked with him all the time and that looked out for him. And
He had a great smile.
Yeah.
He had a fantastic smile.
yeah, he also had a baby face kind of.
Yeah.
John looks
And
a
a
lot.
great voice, too. Is this booming.
You can hear it at the end of Slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
He was the voice of Trafalgar.
Right.
And he delivered it very sort of like naturally, like he was the guy. But yeah, it was a great voice.
He looked like a nice, grown-up Catholic boy.
He was a Minnesota boy, and every once in a while he would return to Minnesota either on a preview or something, and he'd look up his old friends, and I guess they'd have a good old time.
Nobody talked about his piano playing.
Oh, yeah, right.
He'd get up every morning and play
Play Bach every morning.
Every morning, an hour or so before he came to work. Yeah.
And I don't know how long that went on, whether that was a later thing or he did it his
Going
whole
on during
life.
Slaughterhouse.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
So for him, working with Glenn Gould was like a dream come true, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It was like two giants sort of sizing each other up. You know, when George talked Glenn Gould into coming down for Slaughterhouse to record bridges for the Bach piece, Glenn Gould arrived and he drove from Toronto in a 53 Buick, and George said to him, how come you, I always drive. He said, I always drive. And he took out his piano bench, which was a piano bench that his dad carved for him when he was a little boy. He built it for him. And that was responsible for his action when his fingers were somewhere around his jaw when he played the piano. So about an hour before or 2 hours before he was to record, he had this paraffin wax that he dipped his arms in. Then after the wax hardened, he'd walk around with it. And then right before he was to play, he'd crack the wax off so it felt like everything was very supple. And then it came time to eat lunch. And George said to him, should we go out to lunch? And Glenn said, you know, a couple of years ago, I went out to lunch and something happened to me, so I've never been in a restaurant since then. So George said, oh, okay, well, you know, we'll call it in. What would you like? Anything. He said, I'll have scrambled eggs and ketchup. And George said, well, you know, you could get a steak, you could have a lobster, you could do whatever. And Glenn said, no, I'll have scrambled eggs and ketchup. That's why I eat for every meal.
Ketchup.
And he died at age 50.
George Roy Hill's deep knowledge and appreciation for music supported his collaborations not only with Glenn Gould, but with composers Henry Mancini, George Delarue, and Bernard Herrmann. Here Steve Rotter tells a story about how George fought to keep a song in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid that in some ways was a defining element of the film's popularity.
And I remember that he was talking about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and he said that the song Raindrops, everybody was screaming for him to take it out.
Oh, yeah.
That, you know, it had nothing to do with the movie, and it was, it held it up and whatever. And George, I think it was this scene where they went to a preview, and George was in the lobby, and he filled out all the preview cards with different colors, pens. And, favorite scene, Raindrops, favorite scene. And so, because he truly believed that the song would mean a lot to the movie. And indeed, it probably meant an extra, couple of millions of dollars because it was so popular.
I mean, he really did know music.
Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head was written by Hal David and Burt Bacharach for the 1969 film Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It won an Academy Award for Best Original Song. David and Bacharach also won Best Original Score. The single, recorded by B.J. Thomas, sold over 2 million copies by March 14, 1970. ADR supervisor Mel Zelnicker, whose credits include work with directors such as Francis Ford Coppola, Sidney Lumet, Martin Scorsese, the Coen brothers, Brian De Palma, Errol Morris, and Arthur Penn, recalls working with George Roy Hill on The Sting and The Great Waldo Pepper.
The first two shots that I had with George were The Sting, and that followed up with Waldo Pepper. And they were both not the complete jobs. They were just some pickup work in New York. I think most of it was done in L.A. And the first time I met him, I was young in the business. I guess it was my third or fourth year in the business. He was very polite, very soft-spoken, very patrician almost, and showed great patience. ADR sometimes can be taxing. And I guess he was happy with the work I did because then they brought Waldo Pepper back to New York to do some work on it also. And he insisted on me. And both times I was impressed with his total command of the picture, first of all. And working with Bill Reynolds, who was a good friend of mine, George could picture in his mind where he wanted to go with a change in the way a line was read. And he could really redirect the impetus of the scene by just modifying a couple of dub lines. And George was not embarrassed about feeding a line to an actor. Some directors don't like to feed lines. George knew what he wanted to hear, and he wasn't afraid to insist, this is what I want. And sometimes changing a performance can be difficult, but he did it, and people were eager to work for him.
Well, like you were saying, as a New York actor and a New York director knows how to speak to actors. Mm-hmm. And like you were saying, yes, in an ADR stage, if a director gets frustrated, he only makes the actor more nervous and doesn't get what he wants.
Yes, so, and I've seen that over and over again.
He knows how to work with an actor.
Right.
Well, Sidney had that too, because he was an actor. Mm-hmm. Sidney was an actor, and they loved to work with him because he spoke their language.
And Louisa, his wife, was an actress. You know, they had a little brownstone on the east side, and that's where the kids were raised. And they had a place in Fire Island. So it was pretty much an East Coast style of life. Of course, he spent a lot of time away from home, as directors that have that kind of career do. But he loved doing what he did.
Yes.
You know, he loved being a director. He loved being on the set more than anything. You know, I think his family was in the newspaper business in Minnesota.
Yeah, they owned a big paper in Minneapolis.
Right.
Came from a very wealthy family.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
And also, to go through the whole theatrical side of it, he directed one of the finest movie musicals. Thoroughly Modern Millie was a magnificent film. Talk about a divergent genre to be able to get into. You know, he seemed to be able to do it all.
George was also a pilot.
Yeah, Waldo himself.
Great Waldo Pepper, yeah.
And he flew Myrick on the plane from, I don't know, somewhere to somewhere. And Myrick was like a sniveling little baby in the cockpit.
Actually, I saw an interview with Paul Newman. He said if you were ever late to the set, George would take you in his plane and make you sick, and so that you would never do that again.
And he eventually gave that plane to John.
Did John fly?
No.
Well, in World According to GARP, there's that scene where the plane crashes into the house, and George played the pilot of the plane.
Right.
Correct.
Right. That was actually really interesting because it was before special effects. So what they did was they took 2 telephone poles and they built a false front of the house. They saw the wings of the biplane. The planes came in, crashed into the house. There was a net behind the house that caught the plane, and the wings sheared off. And then George popped up saying, everything's okay. So, I do remember that I did talk him into one thing, which was when the airplane went into the house, it was a single take. And he wanted to intercut a shot that he had made, and I talked him out of it, saying that whoever saw one take of a plane from far away come, and crash into the house. So the only thing I was able to sort of like express my opinion about him and do it. Otherwise, it was pretty straightforward.
That really was a confidence builder. That job was a big confidence builder for me because everyone was very encouraging.
For me too, actually.
You know, here I was, this, you know, kid trying to figure out what I was doing. I guess Dan Sable was
Danny was the...
Dan Sable was the sound editor, and Dick was the lead mixer. Dick Voracek was the lead mixer, and I was sort of helping out, second chair. And I had done Melvin and Howard in 1979. That was the very first feature that I ever did. So I was still pretty new, and I really found it. You know, I mean, like, there was something that happened in the mix with me, internally, inside of me, where I was able to, I felt like I was doing a good job. I remember there was a scene, it took place on the football field. And there was this shot that was like a telephoto shot, and Robin Williams and Mary Beth Hurt sort of are walking away from the camera into the distance, and they're getting farther and farther away. And there's this dialogue, and there was a musical interlude too. And it was a matter of balancing the dialogue and playing with the music and fading the dialogue down, trying to make the perspective of them walking away. And it worked. And it was like, oh my God, right. I was able to do that, make it work. It was like, that was a memorable thing. I still remember
the big challenge for that movie, for George, and somewhat for me, was to get the correct performance out of Robin, because of course he had just come from Mork and Mindy and he was all over the place. And George somehow was able to keep him down. In other words, don't be Robin, be GARP. And it probably maybe was the last time that he was able to do that, just because it was such a complicated script to make it understandable to a general audience. As with Tom, in that particular phase of my career, just to please that director and to do it from the very first cut and not to have him like go nuts on how bad the work was, really made all the difference. I mean, when you can do something for someone who's that exalted in, you know, the annals of filmmaking, and you're like, this is your first feature film by yourself, it's just huge. So each day I got more and more comfortable working with him. And so by the end of the film, although the reviews were disappointing, I think it was a film ahead of its time. There were certain things that stand out. One of the things that really stands out is the opening sequence in which the baby was flying in the air, and it was executed by Greenberg and Associates, and the baby was on the floor in a little cradle on a green screen, and the camera would swoop up and swoop down, and they were throwing rattles on the baby, and so they came out with, I don't know, maybe 50,000 feet of film, and I said to George, you know, I said, it'll be great. We just give it to them and they give it back. George said, no, you're going to do it. So, like, I must say, I spent a lot of time on it, and eventually worked out really well and was imitated by, you know, the commercial industry later on. So that was a real challenge. And of course, Hume Cronin and Jessica Tandy were just unbelievable. And she was so beautiful at the age of like 80 that it just took your breath away. A lot of the actors that he worked with, he was personal friends with.
They were probably involved in Playhouse 92.
I'm sure they were.
Oh, they were.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm sure they were. And then, of course, you know, after that film was over and I didn't get hired for the next one, I was like crushed. But he was gracious to everybody, I must say.
He really was.
And then, you know, and then he got sick, and so I saw him a couple of times, and he visited me a couple of times in Connecticut with Bobby. And I remember that the studio, I think it was for the Sting, had given him a Rolls Royce as like a bonus.
Nice.
Why not?
Nice.
And so Bobby drove the Rolls Royce up to Connecticut with George sitting there. So, but that movie just shows you the brilliance of Marion Doherty as a casting person, because it was Glenn Close's first role. It was Robin's first movie role. Mary Beth Hurt had done not that much, and of course, to find a what you would call now a transsexual to play someone, John Lithgow was perfect, but it was...
Nobody had heard of him.
No one had heard of him. It was a leap of faith to think that he could do it, but he was fantastic in it. And then Waldo Pepper That was done on the West Coast.
That was
though.
L.A., yeah.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah,
all.
we just did pickup lines in New York for that.
I remember
Like-
that was one of his pet projects because he was so into flying. Yeah. What was his last film?
Funny Farm.
Funny Farm.
Funny Farm.
Funny Farm was his last film. Yeah, and it was a delightful movie.
I enjoyed the movie. It was a straight out comedy. I mean, it was really.
That's re-recording mixer Lee Dichter, whose credits include work with the Maysles brothers, Christo, Barbara Koppel, Alan Pakula, Sidney Lumet, Bob Fosse, Francis Ford Coppola, Woody Allen, Mike Nichols, Arthur Penn, Robert Altman, Brian De Palma, the Coen brothers, and Ken Burns. Lee Dichter was the re-recording mixer on Hill's final film, Funny Farm. Funny Farm was edited by Alan Heim and starred Chevy Chase.
And Dan Sable did the effects, which were so important in the movie. Because, with slapstick comedy, the sound effects played many scenes. And one of the scenes that I remember was early on in the film when the furniture moving truck, they end up being directed towards this bridge, which they really shouldn't because it's a big truck. And they go over the bridge slowly, like one thing at a time. And the thing is, the bridge caves in, and they back up just in time, and the whole thing just like totally exploded. And it went on for about 20, 30 seconds of just the bridge totally being destroyed. And I remember in the mix that George kept saying, "Give me more, give me more." So Dan had to go back and overlay sound effects, and we were in, I think it was Dolby A at the time. I don't even think we had Dolby. This was in '88. It was Dolby A. So we figured out by over compressing the tracks, we could make it sound louder. Because if you had any valleys in it, it didn't have an impact. If you didn't do it right, you could have it very, very loud in the mix. And when you printed it, printmaster, it would be half the volume. Yeah. So we had to learn early on how to maintain that power going through the process.
George was always able to communicate exactly what he wanted.
Right, which we all want. And a director, that's why it's called director.
A rare talent now.
Give me a direction, because I can do it 1,000 ways, and we don't have time to do it 1,000. He knew what he wanted.
Right. There was no saying, George, I don't think we should do that.
Yeah.
He was like the captain of the ship.
Today's podcast recording was engineered at Soundtrack, New York, by Tyler Newhouse. Frame by Frame is produced by Isabel Sadurni. The music credits for this episode include selections from Glenn Gould's performance of Bach's The Goldberg Variations from the soundtrack to Slaughterhouse-Five, and Burt Bacharach's Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head from the soundtrack to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes of Frame by Frame with the collaborators of Mira Nair and Spike Lee.